Good afternoon. I would like to respectfully acknowledge that UBC Okanagan is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. I would also like to recognize that many of you are joining us today from places near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. My name is Dr. Jennifer Jacoby. I'm the director for the Institute of Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention, as well as co-lead for the Aging in Place Research Cluster here at UBC Okanagan. I warmly welcome you to this afternoon session, and I'm proud to acknowledge that today's event is part of the 11th annual Okanagan Embrace Aging Month. And we're really proud of all the events that have been going on so far and are excited to see you at future events for the remainder of this month. Embrace Aging is co-hosted by the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention at UBC Okanagan, as well as Interior Savings and Interior Health. UBC Okanagan has also joined the global network of age-friendly universities, formalizing its pledge to make UBCO more accessible, intergenerational, and committed to research programs that are informed by the needs of an aging society. If you would like to learn more about the Age-Friendly University Initiative, have suggestions for us, which we welcome, or would like to get involved, please contact the Aging in Place Research Cluster. The URL is quite easy. It's aging in place, all one word, .ok.ubc.ca. Now, as I've indicated, Embrace Aging was launched about 11 years ago to celebrate and raise awareness about positive aging, and has once again organized a number of educational opportunities, including this one today, as well as events during the month. The sessions are designed for everyone, not just for older adults. It's young and old alike, and focus on a variety of topics related to healthy aging and ways to improve quality of life for older adults, their families, and caregivers, and for those that aspire to be an older adult one day. Our goal is to inspire everyone to embrace positive aging. Now, for today's session, I do want to remind you that the closed captioning box can be moved to your preferred place on your screen by clicking and dragging it everywhere to anywhere that you would like. I would also like you to know that for questions, please type your questions in the comments box for the speaker. It's the chat box at the bottom during the presentation, and we'll address questions after the conversation today, or after the talk today in a conversation session rather. Now, the last thing is to turn off your closed caption box. I did indicate how to move it, but I realize you might want to turn it off. If you select the hide caption button on the menu bar, you can turn it off there. Now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Sarah Kraeutner, who's a PhD assistant professor in the Department of Psychology here at UBCO. She is also a Michael Smith Scholar, and she is the lead of the Neuroplasticity, Imagery, and Motor Behavior Laboratory. I love the name, NIMBL. And she is also a member of the Djavad Mowafaghian Center for Brain Health. And I apologize if I did not get that name right. Sarah, I look forward to the correction. So with that, Sarah, I can see your screen, so I think we're ready to go forward. I'll hand it over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Dr. Jacoby, for the warm introduction, and I'm happy to be here for Embrace Aging Okanagan. As Dr. Jacoby mentioned, my name is Sarah Kraeutner, and today my talk is called Flexing Your Brain After Stroke and the Power of Imagination. So first, I'd just like to acknowledge all of those that have supported and are continuing to support the work in my research program over the years. I'd also like to highlight that it takes a team, truly. And so here on the screen, I'm just showing all the individuals who make up my lab. Some of the work I'm showing today was conducted here in my lab, located on the unceded territory of the Syilx peoples. And some of the work I'll be showing was also conducted in collaboration with the Brain Behavior Lab at UBC Vancouver, and/or the Laboratory for Brain Recovery and Function over at Dalhousie University. My lab is comprised of postdocs to second-year undergraduates in programs that span computer science, engineering, psychological sciences, rehabilitation research, kinesiology, and none of this would have been possible without them. So before I get going, I just thought I'd give you a little snapshot of my own journey. I completed a PhD focused on learning skill acquisition through motor imagery. in the Laboratory for Brain Recovery and Function with Sean Bowe at Dalhousie University. Then I did a postdoctoral fellowship focused on relearning after stroke and stroke-related neuroscience at the Brain Behaviour Lab with Laura Boyd over at UBC Vancouver. And now here, my lab, its main goal is to understand non-physical forms of practice to inform their application in health and after stroke. So really, we're focused on how do we improve learning and relearning. So today, what I'm going to do is go over some background about learning and stroke, and then I'll dive into motor imagery. So we learn by repetition with feedback. What do I mean by that? Well, here's a great example. In the summer, I thought I would maybe take up tennis. I've never played tennis before, but I thought, you know what? It's a fun sport. I'm going to try to learn how to play tennis. So how do I learn that? Well, I walk over to the tennis court, I have a racket and I have a ball, and I'm just going to try and attempt at a serve. So I'm going to throw the ball in the air, hit the ball, and hope it lands somewhere on the other side of the court. So we're going to call that my first attempt. After my first attempt, I'm going to be able to see where that ball landed. You know, maybe I aimed for the service box, but maybe I hit the fence. And so I'm going to use that feedback of where the ball actually went relative to where I wanted the ball to go to help improve my next attempt. And so over and over and over, I'm going to repeat my serve. So that's the repetition part. Understanding and being able to see where the ball landed versus where I wanted it to go is one part of what I mean when I say feedback. And so over time, over the course of the summer, yeah, my serves did improve. And so ultimately, we learn by repetition with feedback. And there's a couple different ways that we can measure learning. The first is, to look at those errors that we're making. So this is from a study. The task isn't super important here, to my point, but in this study, participants were basically controlling an on-screen cursor with two squeeze balls, and they had to hit a target. And so same thing, they made numerous attempts over 600 trials, shown here on the horizontal or x-axis, and error is reflected on the vertical or y-axis. And so in their first few attempts, so on the left side of that image, we can see that error is quite high. So those dots are quite high on that vertical axis. And over the course of those 600 attempts, we can see that error is decreasing with training, with practice. And so this is just one way of how we assess performance, and so how we can determine that learning has occurred. The other way that we can assess performance is through speed, so the time it takes for us to actually perform that movement. So here on the x-axis, or that horizontal axis, I again have attempts, which we call trial. And on the y, or vertical axis, now I have movement time. So the time that it takes someone to actually perform that movement. And so at the beginning of training, shown on the left side of that image, right here, we can see that the time it takes to perform that movement is quite high. But across training, all of those attempts, we can see that the time it takes to perform that movement becomes much faster. So in other words, the speed gets faster with training. And this data comes from healthy younger adults in a study that we conducted. But we also did this study in healthy older adults. So the point here is that this does hold true as we age. While there are changes to our learning and control of movement, neuromuscular function as we age, the point here is that we have the capacity to learn across our lifespans, and the way we measure learning is fairly standard. Now, the next piece of background I'd like to get across here is that our experiences change our brains. And in the context of skill learning, every time we perform a movement, we are activating our brains in a specific way. And repeated activation of these areas, plus that feedback, is going to change our brain. So here I'm showing that same figure, the one showing error decreasing across all of those attempts. And what I'm highlighting in red there is the beginning of training. And at the beginning of training, this is what brain activation looked like. So they actually scanned these people's brains when they were performing this task. So at the beginning of all those trials, or all of those attempts, when people were making lots of errors, they showed this specific pattern of brain activation when performing that task. And as learning occurred, at the end of their training, now they're making less errors, their brain activation has shifted. So the point here is that changes in the brain underlie learning. And not only does the pattern of brain activity change, but the ways the areas of the brain are connected changes. So this is just another way to assess or show changes in the brain. This is looking at a 3D brain from the top-down perspective. Left is left. The P stands for posterior or back of the head. And so this is showing connections by those red lines that became more important after training. Or in other words, areas of the brain that are talking to each other more after training. And if you've heard me speak before, this is a metaphor you may have already heard. But to really break this down, let's say there's a trail in the forest that I like to use. And so the first time I experience it by myself, maybe I go for a walk or a run. Then I start to invite my friends along. And so the more and more we use this path, the more it gets smoothed out. And it probably widens into something that looks like this. So now it's wider, so more and more people can use this trail. And it continues to become tread on, and more people start to go on it. Maybe ATVs or bikes start to go on it, and eventually cars start to go on it. And eventually it becomes a smooth paved highway. So repeated use of this pathway is going to smoothen it out, make us be able to move faster on it, get between cities or towns faster. And this is similar as to what happens in the brain. Repeated use or repeated experiences is going to smoothen out that pathway, allowing the brain to transfer information faster. And so across time, repetitive practice and feedback is going to drive these changes in the brain, which ultimately leads to learning. So that really truly was the basics of how we learn skills in just a handful of minutes. But what about when we lose a skill we've learned? What about individuals who are no longer able to perform movements and activities of daily living, like after stroke? We know that 85% or over 85% of stroke survivors experience chronic upper limb impairment. Chronic meaning persistent, past 6 months. Upper limb referring to typically the hand and arm. So just to orient you to what a stroke is, there are two types of stroke. One where brain damage results from a blockage of blood vessels and a lack of blood flow to an area, so that's ischemic stroke. And another from a rupture of blood vessels and a leakage of blood flow in an area, that's hemorrhagic stroke. Both cause damage to the brain. And many strokes occur in the middle cerebral artery, so a blood supply right up through the center of our brains. And this runs right through the areas of the brain which are important for movement or which control movement. And it's this damage to the brain that causes upper limb impairment. Again, upper limb referring to the hands and arms. So essentially, because of this damage, when we go to perform a movement, we're now seeing something different happen in the brain. Your smooth paved highway has turned into a rough trail because you are no longer able to activate the right areas, in quotes, the right areas, due to damage in that pathway. And so in a stroke or neurorehabilitation context, we need to go back to our fundamentals. We need to use repetition and feedback in our interventions to drive changes in the brain to facilitate relearning of skills we have lost. And this, of course, is not a new concept. This is exactly what physical therapy is and what it's based on. So this is really nice work from Christian Grefkes and Fink. What I'm showing here is from their study. So on the right side of the screen where it says grip strength percentage, this is showing someone's improvement or ability to grip something across 4 different sessions. So each of those blue bars represents a different session. On the left side, we're showing brain activation that corresponds with each of those sessions. So one blue bar corresponds to one of those brain images. And what we're looking at on the brains is we're looking at the brain from a top-down view, and all of those warm colors, so the reds and yellows, are showing brain activation during that grip task. So we have grip strength across 4 sessions in individuals after stroke. On the left, we have brain activation associated with that grip task shown from a top-down view. So here they show that as individuals after stroke were able to improve their grip strength early over the course of recovery, or the first 10 days, the brain activity was changing, increasing, with further changes in brain activity observed as improvements in grip strength continued over the course of 4 months after stroke. So in other words, changes in brain activity were highly related to improvements in hand function that occurred over the course of recovery. What I just showed was evidence in the acute or subacute phase after stroke, typically when most of the physical therapy is happening. But we also see similar things in chronic or more than 6 months post-stroke. So in this study, individuals more than 6 months after the stroke came in for a 1-month intervention. And this was quite a fun study. So in this intervention, individuals were sitting in front of a fairly large TV screen, and we called it semi-immersive or semi-virtual reality because there was a camera on top of the TV screen that could actually track someone's hand and arm movements. And every time you moved your hand, you actually controlled a spaceship on the screen. And the goal of this game is basically to move the spaceship around to catch asteroids that were moving across the screen. So you'd basically see an asteroid coming across the screen, and your goal was to catch it with the spaceship and then toss it off of the screen. And so at the beginning of the game, the asteroids moved quite slowly. But if you got better at the game, so as you were able to catch and throw the asteroids off the screen, you could progress up through difficulty levels where the asteroids moved faster and became much smaller. And so after 1 month of practice on the game, catching and throwing the asteroids, we saw that this practice drove changes in the brain. And so here again, I'm showing a 2D slice from the top-down view, left is left, right is right. Specific areas of the brain, shown by that red line, became more connected. So we're talking to each other more after the 1 month of practice. And as practice on the game occurred over that month, from the first attempt to the 5,000th attempt, individuals were able to make faster and more accurate movements. So we saw a nice decrease in the time it took to catch the asteroid on the screen, even as difficulty became harder. So in other words, people got better at and learned the game by relearning how to make efficient and quick movements with their hand and arm. And ultimately, these changes in the brain underlie the learning or relearning that occurred. So motor learning is fundamental to rehabilitation after stroke or neurological injury. In other words, neurorehabilitation at its core is grounded in the principles of motor learning. So this is the story so far. We know that learning is an important part of human behavior, and that learning requires repetitive activity and feedback. The same way that we learn skills in health or healthy young adults is how we learn them after stroke or neurological injury. Repetition of skilled tasks after an injury like stroke is what drives these changes in our brain and ultimately functional recovery. So now I'm going to switch gears slightly and ask the question, what if there are barriers to practice? These barriers might include things like access to physical therapy. So what I'm showing on the screen right now is a map of Interior Health Authority and all of the different towns and cities that are included in our Interior Health Authority. As you can see, this spans quite a vast area in British Columbia. We have Princeton, Kelowna, Fernie, Cranbrook, Revelstoke. All of these different towns and cities are included in Interior Health Authority. Do all of these different areas have the same access to physical therapy? What I'm showing on the left is a screenshot taken off of Google Maps of the city of Kelowna. And all I did was type in physical therapist, city of Kelowna. And as you can see, there's quite a number of options in our city. And yes, this map extends a little bit to Lake Country. But the point being, there's a lot of different options for physical therapists within our city here. On the right side of the screen, this is now a snapshot or a screenshot of the Kootenay region. So instead of just one city, a whole bunch of towns and cities that are part of the Kootenays. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of a different story. The number of physical therapists within the Kootenays as a whole is a lot less than the number of physical therapists just in Kelowna or Kelowna proper. There also might be barriers related to the dose of therapy, or what we call the dose problem. So it's recommended that one receives 3 hours of therapy after stroke to drive recovery. But in a study that surveyed, the actual daily dose of therapy received or delivered after stroke, they found that it was less than 1 hour. And in further work by Hayward et al., they found that only 8 minutes per day was dedicated to restoring upper limb function. 8 minutes out of 3 recommended hours to the upper limb, or the hand and arm. And so it's very critical that we develop and test adjunct therapies that we can use to augment the standard of care and physical therapies. And the good news is that we can do this because repetitive practice does not need to be physical. So motor imagery is the mental rehearsal of a motor skill, or the imagined movement. It's one form of non-physical, or what we call covert practice, because it does not require overt movement. And so going back to my example of trying to learn how to play tennis in the summer, instead of going to the tennis court and hitting the tennis ball, maybe it was rainy or something, I could sit at home and imagine myself hit that tennis ball. And I can perform motor imagery in 2 different ways, 2 main ways. One way that we can perform motor imagery is what we call the third person or visual perspective, shown on the left side of the screen there. I might imagine Serena Williams, as if I'm watching a video of Serena Williams, serve a tennis ball. And when I perform third person or visual motor imagery, I might focus on the color of that image, the vividness of that picture I'm creating, and the content of that picture I'm creating in my mind. The other way I might perform motor imagery is what we refer to as the first person or kinesthetic perspective. And so now I could imagine myself performing that movement as if it's from behind my own eyes. So that first person perspective. And when I perform first person or kinesthetic motor imagery, I might focus on the sensations associated with that movement. Maybe what it feels like when the tennis racket makes contact with the ball, where my shoulder is in space, where my elbow is in space, and I might then envision where the ball lands after I've hit it. So our first question, again, thinking about using motor imagery as an adjunct to physical therapy, is does motor imagery work in combination with physical practice? And there are, of course, a number of studies that have investigated this, including some of our own work. But keeping in line with the theme, I've chosen to highlight some work that, of course, use motor imagery in a tennis context, because a lot of what we know about motor imagery comes from the sports literature. So this study involved high-level youth players. The athletes engaged in 8 weeks of physical training. And then what they did was they flipped to 8 weeks of combined physical and motor imagery training. So in this image, they have weeks on the X or horizontal axis, and on the Y or vertical axis, they have performance outcome. So they assess performance or learning in 2 different ways. The first way they assessed performance was simply just success of the serve. Could you even get the ball over the net? And they basically looked at this as a percentage of how many serves they attempted to do versus how many serves that were successful. So higher numbers mean more success, lower numbers mean less success. They also assessed performance based on accuracy. So on the other side of the net, they had a box with a whole bunch of different targets, and the harder targets were worth more points. And so they would pick the harder targets and say, try to hit those. And they were awarded points for the targets that they could hit, with, again, the harder areas worth more points. So after 8 weeks of regular physical training, they showed that serve success went up. So these athletes were able to just successfully hit the balls over the net, kind of the same as what I found in the summer. But they didn't show any improvement on accuracy. So they could hit the ball over the net, but they couldn't pick out the targets that they were asked to hit. But when motor imagery was added into their training, simple serve success improved slightly, but not over and above what they got from physical practice. But motor imagery combined with physical training improved accuracy, which meant that athletes were more able to accurately hit the targets that they were asked to hit and were thus awarded more points. So motor imagery actually leveraged the effects of physical practice. Combining these two forms of practice led to improved outcomes. And this is what provides the rationale for the use of motor imagery as an adjunct to the standard of care, physical therapy. But what about in situations where physical therapy is not possible or not desired due to fatigue, level of motor impairment, a myriad of other factors, which include like infrastructure, access, etc. So this leads us to the question, does motor imagery work alone? And now I'm going to take a little bit of time to explain how we answered this question. So to address this question and investigate it, we use a special type of learning task where participants were going to practice a sequence, and then we assess learning of this sequence versus a sequence they never trained on. So we call this the untrained, something that they've not practiced, versus the trained task. And the special type of learning that we're looking at here is called implicit sequence learning for those wanting the details, but that specific phrase is not necessarily relevant or not necessarily important. So this task was established in the 80s based on physical practice. And in this task, participants might see a screen like this with 4 sort of placeholders. And the placeholders on the screen are going to be linked to some assigned keys on a keyboard. So there I've highlighted the keys A, S, D, F. So each of these placeholders is going to be linked to one of those 4 keys. And so what happens is a cue appears on the screen, and the participant or the person is asked to respond by hitting the corresponding button. So in this case, it's the D key. So another cue appears and they hit the corresponding button. Another cue appears, they hit the corresponding button, and so on and so forth. And these cues appear seemingly random. Okay, so where they're coming up on the screen, they just appear totally random to you. But what you're not aware of is that embedded within all of your training, there's actually certain chunks or sequences that repeat. So a repeating sequence. And so what ends up happening is you're actually unknowingly training on a specific sequence or a specific sequence of button presses. And we can measure the learning based on reaction or response time differences between that trained versus untrained sequences. So again, the trained sequence being that one you've unknowingly practiced on, and the untrained sequence just being like truly random cues. And so here on the horizontal or x-axis is the sequence type, trained versus untrained. And on the y or vertical axis, we have reaction or response time. And so learning is going to be indicated by faster reaction times to the trained or repeated sequence versus the untrained or random sequence. So here we're showing that by the circles being lower than the triangles. So again, circles lower than triangles, learning has occurred. Circles similar to triangles, learning has not occurred. And we assess this after all of the training has finished. Now, just to show you that this works, here's data from a group of people that physically practice this task. Again, this is not new. This type of task and learning comes from a long line of work established by Neeson and Bulmer in the 80s. But to get this point across, the circles, or the trained reaction times, the trained sequence, is much faster than your reaction times to the untrained or random sequences. And so to answer a question about motor imagery, we created an imagery version of this task. And in our imagery version of this task, people are going to practice this task only through imagery. So they're never, ever going to physically touch the buttons until we test them after all of their training. And as you just saw, then we compare their physical abilities on the trained sequence versus the untrained or random sequences. So they do a whole bunch of motor imagery training, and then boom, we actually ask them to hit the buttons. And so what we saw is that motor imagery training led to circles lower than the triangles, or faster response times for that trained repeating sequence, the one that you've unknowingly trained on, versus that untrained or random sequences. So in other words, the speed was faster on the task that was only ever practiced through imagery. They've never practiced these sequences before physically. They also can't recognize a sequence, say it out loud, but they can do it much faster than a sequence they've not practiced before. And maybe you might say, well, what if they just learned it really fast when they, actually had to hit the buttons in that little test block that you did? Well, we did another study and showed that the amount of learning depends on the dose of imagery training. So in other words, the more you practice via imagery, let's say you practice for 40 minutes instead of 20 minutes, the faster you're going to get on the task, or the lower the circles are going to be compared to those triangles. So we know that motor imagery works in combination with physical practice, which provides the basis for its effectiveness as an adjunct therapy. And we know that motor imagery works alone, just by imagining performing something without any prior physical practice, without ever physically performing a skill. You are able to learn the skill. That's pretty cool. And yes, that work, that sequence work, has been replicated using a more complex motor task, something a little bit more complex than just, of course, hitting buttons. And this is what provides its basis for its effectiveness in situations when physical therapy is not possible or desired due to the level of motor impairment, access fatigue, or many other factors. So it's looking pretty positive so far. We've established the basis for its effectiveness after stroke. So the next question is, does motor imagery actually work after stroke? And when we turn to the studies that examine motor imagery in stroke and evaluate functional outcomes, so hand and arm function, after using motor imagery as an intervention, we see some studies with really positive outcomes. Motor imagery did drive functional recovery. But we also see a few instances where motor imagery was not effective. In other words, functional outcomes, hand and arm function, did not improve after a motor imagery intervention. The evidence is mixed. And one central question to my research program now is why? Why is the evidence mixed? Why does it work for some people and not for others? And how do we improve its efficacy? Well, one reason for this is that stroke, damage to the brain, may impact the brain's response to motor imagery. So what I'm going to show is some figures of brain activation during motor imagery in healthy controls versus individuals after stroke. The dark spots are going to represent where in the brain activation is occurring. So this is going to be a grayscaled figure. We're going to show this in 3 different perspectives. This is work from Sharma et al. In 2009. This particular image is looking front on. So those 2 circles are actually representing the eyeballs. They're also going to show a side view and then a top-down view of the brain. And this is perhaps one of the first studies to compare brain activation during a motor imagery task in individuals after stroke versus controls. Again, the dark spots represent where in the brain activation is occurring. So this is activation for healthy controls performing motor imagery. And this is brain activation during motor imagery after stroke. So after stroke, visually, you can see that the clusters, those dark spots, are roughly in the same areas, even though perhaps there looks like less brain activation during motor imagery after stroke. And now I'm just showing similar images from some of our other work to hone in on some important features that are harder to see in that original Sharma paper. Activation during motor imagery, regardless as to whether it's after a stroke or not, occurs across the areas of the brain that are important for movement. So the areas of the brain that are activated during repetition of physical movement that we saw in the first half of my talk. And since we were getting activation in the quote-unquote right areas, does this translate to relearning? So this is a study investigating exactly that. Here they investigated motor imagery as a tool for rehabilitation after stroke to look at if motor imagery outcomes could translate to learning and recovery. So in this study, a group of individuals after stroke who had limited or no function of their upper limbs and hand engaged in 4 weeks of motor imagery training. Before and after the therapy, or before and after the motor imagery, the 4 weeks of imagery, their hand function was assessed, and they also had a brain scan while they attempted to perform the movement or had someone help them perform the movement. So what we're going to look at is brain activation while they either attempted to perform the movement or had help perform the movement before and after the 4 weeks of motor imagery. So in this study, they showed their data plotted on 3D brains, just showing the left and right hemispheres. And again, warm colors are going to show brain activation. So this is what brain activation looked like when they attempted that movement before the imagery intervention. Doing motor imagery for 4 weeks after stroke actually led to recovery of brain activity. So they saw increased activation in areas of the brain that control movement. And this was linked to improved recovery. So improved ability or function of the hand and arm. Again, this is very similar to what we've seen after physical therapy. But there is a caveat. In this study, they actually split the results into 2 subsets of individuals. The top row I just showed you was one subset of individuals, and the bottom row shows you the other subset of individuals in the study. This subset of individuals showed the opposite pattern. So they actually started with a lot of brain activation, and this actually decreased after the 4 weeks of imagery. And so here what they actually showed was in these individuals, they showed decreased activity in the areas of the brain that control movement. And so here, just summarizing that, what they found in one slide. After the 4 weeks of motor imagery training, some individuals showed increased or recovered activity, and some individuals showed decreased activity or the opposite pattern. And the important part is when they link this to functional recovery, the individuals that restored activity had better recovery of hand and arm function, whereas the individuals who had decreased activity showed more variable recovery, meaning that some showed no improvements in hand and arm function. So that brings us to the question, how do inter-individual differences after stroke impact the brain's response to motor imagery? We need to understand how stroke, which again damage to the brain, impacts the brain's response to motor imagery at the level of the individual, not the level of the group. So in this last part of my talk today, I'm going to highlight the importance of inter-individual differences and also show you some data from ongoing work that suggests that these inter-individual differences after stroke do impact the brain's response to motor imagery. Now, when we take a closer look at the literature, this is from a systematic review, meaning it's a compilation of a number of studies. So a research team will review the literature and pull information from a whole bunch of different studies. And so here they pulled information from a number of studies evaluating motor imagery ability after stroke. In those studies, participants were simply asked if they could perform motor imagery and rate their motor imagery itself on a scale. They also had reported where their lesions were located. So effectively, what these authors did, this research team did, was they evaluated one's ability to perform motor imagery based on lesion location. And this is going to be a figure from their results. This figure is going to show the percentage of total individuals in their study that reported impaired ability to perform motor imagery, so some difficulties performing motor imagery, or reported not being able to do motor imagery at all. And it's going to be based on lesion location. So the red-yellow color bar there on the side represents the percentage of participants either impaired or having difficulties when performing motor imagery, shown in that middle column or second column, and percentage of participants who are unable to perform motor imagery on that right-hand column. And they're going to show the results in 3 different orientations of the brain: a side or sagittal view, a back or coronal view, and a top-down or axial view. Okay, so for example, anywhere you see yellow indicates 67% of individuals in their study, and the color itself is going to be plotted or is going to be linked to a different area of the brain where those lesions were located. So here what they showed was that impairment in motor imagery ability was associated with parietal and frontal lesions. Again, almost 67% of their sample. And some with parietal damage reported being totally unable to do motor imagery. Not everyone with parietal damage, just some. And altogether, this means that lesions to some frontal areas may impair one's ability to do motor imagery, or perhaps a specific type of motor imagery, which was not measured in the study. And lesions to parietal areas may impact one's ability to do motor imagery. So I'll say that again. It may well be that individuals after stroke with parietal damage or damage to specific parietal areas might not be able to do motor imagery or generate those motor images, which means engaging in a motor imagery-based therapy might not be helpful to them. On the flip side, someone with a lesion in, say, the motor cortex, a motor imagery-based therapy might be very helpful to them. And so taking this another step forward, it's important to understand these individual factors and differences that are linked to one's ability to do motor imagery or to use it effectively as a tool to drive recovery. It's not just lesion location that might be important. I did just allude to motor imagery ability, so we can look at motor imagery ability across different types of imagery: visual for third person, kinesthetic, first person. We can also look at things like level of motor impairment, because again, no stroke is exactly the same. And so in this ongoing work, we're looking to see if each of these factors influence the pattern of brain activation that occurs during motor imagery. And so in this study, individuals after stroke come in and first do a number of assessments, which include things like assessments of function and level of motor impairment in the hand and arm, one's ability to perform visual third-person motor imagery, one's ability to perform kinesthetic first-person motor imagery. There are a number of factors, but I'm not going to get into all of them today, just in the interest of time. And then the individuals are going to engage in an experiment where they're asked to perform motor imagery of an everyday task involving their affected hand or arm during a brain scan, in this case, functional magnetic resonance imaging. And so in this study, we have a number of individuals with all different levels of impairment and imagery abilities, so a spectrum. And here's what we found so far. So what I'm going to show is a number of 2D slices shown from the top down. Red colors are going to indicate areas where motor imagery ability, in this specific instance, kinesthetic motor imagery ability, is associated with brain activation during the motor imagery task. And this 3D brain on the screen right now is just showing where all of those slices are taken from. So here, the red color indicates areas where imagery ability was associated with brain activation during the motor imagery task. Again, this is for kinesthetic motor imagery ability. Generally, what we see is that greater motor imagery ability for each specific type of imagery ability, so kinesthetic or visual, is associated with enhanced activation in areas of the brain that control movement, which means the effectiveness of motor imagery interventions may be improved by matching the type of imagery practiced to the type of imagery one is good at. And this might seem like common sense, but unfortunately, it hasn't been investigated before. And two, assessing different types of motor imagery ability before using it in a clinical trial or in a motor imagery intervention has not really been done before. It's not really been done in practice. And so really, imagery is a skill in itself. So match the type of imagery you are good at to the type used in the intervention. Now I'm going to show you another set of 2D slices of the brain, where the red color is going to indicate areas where level of motor impairment was associated with brain activation during the motor imagery task. And this 3D brain on the screen right now is again showing where the slices are taken from. So showing this across multiple slices, we see associations between motor impairment and activity during the motor task found in areas like frontal and hippocampal regions, areas that are really thought to contribute to motor imagery vividness, or how vivid of a picture from your memory you are able to produce. So we take this to mean increased upper limb motor impairment may impede imagery vividness, but not the motor or kinesthetic aspects. And so linking this back to the types of motor imagery, in other words, perhaps individuals with a high level of motor impairment should focus on kinesthetic motor imagery rather than visual or third-person motor imagery. And so where are we going with this next? Can we use individual profiles to inform intervention? Really, to maximize someone's recovery after stroke, we need to better understand the impact of these inter-individual differences and leverage this information to tailor our interventions to the individual. So I've shown you our ongoing work from what we're calling phase 1. We've asked the question, how do inter-individual differences after stroke impact the brain's response to motor imagery? And in the next phase, we're aiming to use this information to improve motor imagery-based interventions, tailoring these interventions to the individual based on what we've discovered. Now, phase 1, which I didn't get into, has a number of experiments associated with it. Not only are we asking and addressing this question using neuroimaging, we are testing this in other ways. So phase 2 really represents our long-term goal. And so in future, we would really hope that all of our motor imagery interventions and clinical trials are found to be effective because we've tailored them to each individual. And so that brings us to the end of our time together. Before we depart, I will leave you with some take-home messages. The first is that learning is critical to recovery of function after stroke, but repetitive practice does not need to be physical. Motor imagery, or the mental rehearsal of movement, works in combination with physical practice, and so it shows promise as an adjunct therapy. Motor imagery also works by itself, without any prior physical training, which means that it shows promise when physical therapy is not possible or desired. But understanding how inter-individual differences after stroke impact the brain's response to motor imagery will improve its effectiveness in practice. And with that, I would just like to say thank you very much for your time today. And again, just like to acknowledge all those that support my work and research program over the years.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kraeutner. That was a wonderful talk. I've learned so much. We've got a couple of questions in the chat box. I'm going to remind participants, if you do have anything to ask, please place it in the chat box. I'm going to start by asking kind of a bigger picture question with respect to that beautiful slide that you showed us between the different parts of research, the intervention part on the second right-hand side and the progress you're making towards it. How would individuals, if they want to participate, whether it be in research studies in your lab or even at the institution, how would they go about finding information for this and then coming forward? And second part to the question, what might they expect generally within your research to be a participant?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. There is no one consolidated portal of where to participate in research in BC, which I think is a perfect project for a PhD or a postdoc down the road. Really, so there's often two main ways. One is sometimes research is advertised on Facebook Marketplace, or Kijiji was used a lot in, I know this isn't like a Kijiji forward area. So just online in these sorts of forums. Also, research is typically advertised on someone's own lab website. So for example, if you were to go to my lab website, you might see some studies that you could participate in. Right now, what I didn't mention is that the stroke work that I showed today is all conducted on the UBC Vancouver campus because unfortunately there is no research MRI scanner here. But my lab also does non-invasive brain stimulation, and we can use a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation to assess brain function in a different way to neuroimaging. And so those are the studies that we have going on at this campus.
That's great.
Yeah, I think also sometimes on the different like university web pages, you can find like the different research labs and navigate to what's going on and what research is going on there.
Yeah, there's so much information on individual websites as well as the university websites. Additional to that, there's Reach BC. It's literally one word, reachbc.ca. And there's some opportunities there for understanding research across the province for both clinical as non-clinical research. So there's just so many ways, and how you find it is so amazing and beautiful. I know there's individuals, I believe on the call as well, that have participated in some of this research that's done. I know my lab does it as well through Reach BC. So if our attendees are interested, I encourage you to explore the website and the various opportunities that are there. And as Dr. Kraeutner said, there's just so much richness in the variability that's evident between labs and between campuses with respect to UBC.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say there's a really nice comment in the chat that states that they belong to a stroke recovery Zoom group that would benefit from this. One, absolutely, you can grab the recorded talk, and two, I would also love to present at your group if that's an option. That was going to be the next thing that I mentioned. You know, when we have studies that we're recruiting for on campus, we often try to go to those that we know would be interested or feel like would be of interest or would benefit. So I'm more than happy to drop into a stroke recovery group. Like I said, unfortunately, all of this work is currently going on at UBCV, but we will have a study that involves the non-invasive brain stimulation starting, and it actually uses that asteroid game that I mentioned. Hopefully in the next, I'm going to gently say 2 months. We hoped for last year, which sounds really sad. But the study that we want to do is actually bringing it out of the laboratory. So one thing that we've been really working towards is packaging up our really bulky laboratory task that requires, 2 or 3 students and myself to be on site to run into a Chromebook with a webcam. And so you can actually take this thing into your home and play the asteroid game wherever you want. And just in terms of like device logistics and technology, that's where some of the delays have come from. But hopefully that'll be up and running in the next month or two. And then we'll be recruiting for that study as well.
That's beautiful. It's so nice to see research actually moving from, behind the closed doors, which aren't closed, it's just an expression, behind the university doors and out into the community. I guess with respect to the community, if a person wanted to practice motor imagery training to better a skill, is it just performance skills, or could it be life skills? And as they're practicing, could they do anything wrong?
Sorry, I'm still a little bit sick. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Perhaps next year I'll make my talk all about like the application of motor imagery and the different types of techniques someone can use, assuming that next year exists. So we don't really know too much about what can someone practice wrong. To me, it would be like similar to physical practice, right? Like going back to that tennis serve example, there is a right tennis technique and there is a wrong tennis technique. And so if I'm imagining the wrong tennis technique, that's going to lead to mislearning or unlearning of my good tennis technique. In terms of performance and activities of daily living or life skills, absolutely. The motor part of motor imagery really does refer to skills that require movements. But visual imagery is another type of imagery which involves, or which relates to kind of everything. And I think, there's a lot of people that don't actually realize that they're doing imagery. So for example, if you have an interview the next day for something, for a job, you might be rehearsing what you're going to say in your mind. That's actually one form of imagery, of mental rehearsal. You might picture that person the interviewer sitting across from you at the desk, and you would be rehearsing what's going on. Medical students, they use imagery all the time, especially the surgical interns and residents. And whether or not they, consciously know that it's motor imagery, they're still doing it. And so, yes, you can absolutely use imagery for life skills as well as performance.
That's great. I guess practice perfect comes into mind, whether it's physical or mental. So thank you for sharing today. It was a really, really enlightening talk. It was a great walk through what we can do as individuals to enhance performance in a very alternative way when we don't have access to some of the wonderful things that larger centers might have access to. So thank you for sharing that approach. I'm also going to identify that tomorrow is Friday, and at UBC Okanagan, in addition to the Embrace Aging Month activities, we also have Brain Awareness Month. Could you just give us a 20-second little reminder of the timing of brain awareness as well as an overview of the activities, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So Brain Awareness Week is an international initiative that's just being created by the Dana Foundation to basically increase public awareness of brain health and brain research all over the world. So it's the same week everywhere internationally. It's supposed to coincide with spring break to make it, family friendly as well. Tomorrow we have an open house on campus. My lab is participating in this open house. It's from 1 to 4, but from 3:30 to 4 is a keynote. A talk by Dr. Daryl Weil, who is a neurologist and specializes in Parkinson's. And so from 1 to really 3:30, you can come to campus, tour the labs, tour all of the labs that are involved in studying the brain and in brain health.
Thank you for sharing. And if you want to know which various labs are participating, I understand there's going to be balloons outside the door, so you can't go wrong, as well as prizes on campus. So thank you for hosting this, especially coinciding with Embrace Aging. So for attendees, if you're looking for other events with respect to Embrace Aging, there's still a number upcoming for the month of March. Please look at our website at OkanaganEmbraceAging.com for all the events and registration. We look forward to growing this event. So if you have suggestions or if you would like to partner, please reach out to us through the website. The contact's there. For following this event, you are going to receive an email with a link to an online evaluation form. And we really do welcome your feedback and suggestions for both this event as well as planning future events. And with that being said, I would like to thank very much Dr. Kraeutner for her talk this afternoon. It's been a pleasure. And thank you everyone for attending. Have a splendid afternoon, and it looks like it's even sunny. So have a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.